The year was 1917, and the Romanov family was in terrible trouble. Do not do the Russian accent.
For over a century, the tragic fate of the Romanov family has been shrouded in mystery, fueling countless theories, debates, and conspiracy whispers.
Evidence is overwhelming.
Yeah, absolutely. That's their son.
Exactly.
And they had one son, and that's Alexei.
Exactly.
Right.
But now, scientists have turned to cutting-edge artificial intelligence to finally uncover the truth. And the results are nothing like what historians expected. This groundbreaking revelation challenges long-held beliefs and raises unsettling new questions about one of history's darkest royal chapters. So, could AI have rewritten the Romanov story forever? The shocking answer will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. AI, DNA, and the Romanov mystery. The execution of Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Tsarina Alexandra, and their 5 children in July 1918 marked one of the darkest moments in Russian history. It did not simply end a royal family's life, it opened a mystery that haunted the world for decades. People were left asking, where were their bodies? Were they all truly dead, or had someone managed to escape the massacre? With no official burial site and years of silence from Soviet authorities, speculation grew wild. Stories spread about secret survivors, hidden graves, and imposters claiming to be lost Romanovs. For much of the 20th century, the truth lay buried both literally and figuratively. Then, in 1991, more than 70 years after the killings, 9 skeletons were discovered in a forest near Yekaterinburg, the very city where the Romanovs had been executed. The find shocked the world, but solving the puzzle was not easy. These bones were fragile, incomplete, and badly degraded after decades underground. Traditional forensic methods, which relied on strong physical evidence, struggled to give definite answers. At that time, however, DNA analysis was beginning to emerge as a powerful new tool in forensic science. Scientists turned to short tandem repeats, STRS, small repeating sections of DNA that vary between individuals, to begin piecing together identities. What they had to work with was minimal, sometimes only a few dozen cells left in a bone fragment. Still, researchers persisted, and as technology advanced, artificial intelligence began to play an important role. AI-powered bioinformatics systems could process faint genetic signals, remove background noise, and detect patterns invisible to the human eye. With these tools, even damaged genetic material could be turned into usable data. Slowly but surely, scientists reconstructed DNA profiles that could show family relationships among the remains. The first results were astonishing. Autosomal STR analysis indicated the presence of a father, a mother, and 3 daughters within the set of skeletons. This strongly suggested Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their girls had been found. But how could this be confirmed as the Romanovs, and not just another Russian family? Here, mitochondrial DNA, passed down the maternal line, played a crucial role. Alexandra's maternal DNA could be compared with that of living relatives. One such relative was Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, who was Alexandra's grandnephew. Using advanced AI-assisted sequence alignment tools, scientists compared Alexandra's genetic code with Prince Philip's. The match was undeniable. Even more compelling was the case of Nicholas II. His DNA contained a rare anomaly known as heteroplasmy, a condition where more than one type of mitochondrial DNA is present in a person. Some experts initially doubted the results, but when scientists exhumed the remains of Nicholas's brother and compared the sequences using AI modeling, the rare trait appeared again, confirming the identity beyond doubt. Yet 2 members of the family remained unaccounted for: the young heir Alexei and one of the daughters, later believed to be Maria. Their absence fueled rumors of escape and survival. For years, claimants stepped forward, the most famous being Anna Anderson, who insisted she was Anastasia. Her story captivated the world, inspiring books, movies, and debates. But science eventually had the final word. When preserved tissue from Anna Anderson was tested, AI-enhanced mitochondrial sequencing proved conclusively that she had no genetic connection to the Romanovs. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place much later. Additional bone fragments were discovered in the same forest. With the help of advanced computational analysis, researchers combined STR testing, mitochondrial DNA comparisons, and Y chromosome analysis. The results were decisive. The remains of Alexei and Maria had been found. The Romanov family was at last reunited in death. This discovery did more than end a century-old mystery. It represented a turning point in forensic science. The Romanov case showed the world how artificial intelligence could enhance genetic research, making it possible to identify people even from degraded, nearly vanished samples. The techniques pioneered here are now standard in investigations of war crimes, natural disasters, and unsolved cases around the globe. The story of the Romanovs, once clouded by rumors and legends, was finally illuminated by science. What gossip and speculation could not solve, data-driven truth revealed. The last chapter of the Romanovs' tragic saga was written not in whispers of conspiracy, but in the undeniable language of DNA. Who are the Romanovs? Why is the mystery so important? Let's delve into the details of the historical fall of the centuries-old rule of the Romanovs. The fall of an empire built on glitter and cracks. For more than 3 centuries, the Romanovs stood as one of the most powerful ruling families in all of Europe. Their story was wrapped in gold and velvet, lavish balls lit by glittering chandeliers, palaces filled with priceless treasures, and jeweled crowns that shone as symbols of unmatched authority. The Romanov name became synonymous with wealth, power, and the very idea of Russia itself. To many, they seemed unshakable, destined to rule forever, their dynasty woven tightly into the nation's identity. But even the strongest-looking walls can hide cracks, and behind the splendor of the Romanov court, shadows were quietly gathering. Russia was a vast empire, stretching across frozen tundras, endless forests, and bustling cities. Yet beneath the grandeur lay a country that was deeply wounded. Poverty clung to the lives of ordinary people, famine haunted the villages, and resentment brewed like a storm. The opulence of the royal family stood in sharp contrast to the hunger of peasants, who toiled endlessly in the fields with little reward. By the early 20th century, these cracks widened into gaping wounds. Russia had become a country struggling to find its place in a rapidly changing world. Industrialization had brought factories and cities, but it also delivered harsh working conditions and little improvement to everyday lives. The people were growing restless, and whispers of revolution spread like wildfire through the streets. The strain only deepened when Russia entered World War I. The war drained the empire of food, resources, and hope. Soldiers faced brutal losses on the front lines, while families at home endured cold winters and empty stomachs. At the center of this storm was Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia. Unlike some of his strong-willed ancestors, Nicholas was not equipped to handle the weight of an empire in crisis. He was devoted to his family and deeply religious, but he lacked the political vision and strength that his role demanded. His decisions often seemed out of touch with the suffering of his people. Instead of calming the unrest, his actions, sometimes stubborn, sometimes hesitant, only added fuel to the fire. The people's patience wore thin. Demonstrations filled the streets of Petrograd, and calls for bread and peace turned into calls for change. Nicholas believed his soldiers would remain loyal to him as they had for centuries. But this time, history took a different turn. Worn down by hunger and despair, the soldiers joined the very crowds they were meant to control. In that moment, the last thread of royal power began to unravel. Faced with a nation in chaos, Nicholas was forced to make a decision that would change Russia forever. In March 1917, he signed his abdication, stepping down from the throne his family had held for 300 years. It was not just the end of his reign, it was the end of an entire dynasty that had once seemed untouchable. The Romanovs, once the embodiment of Russia's glory, were now powerless, their crowns and scepters reduced to symbols of a vanished world. The fall of the Romanovs did not come with a single blow, but rather as the slow crumbling of a weakened empire. It was as if centuries of splendor had dissolved in a single moment, leaving behind dust and echoes of what once was. Their story, marked by grandeur and tragedy, remains one of the most striking examples of how even the most powerful dynasties can fall when the cries of the people grow louder than the commands of kings. And so, the curtain closed on 300 years of Romanov rule. The palaces that once echoed with music and laughter would soon stand as silent reminders of a vanished empire. The Russian Revolution had swept away the old order, and with it, the family that had ruled as though they were eternal. Yet their story endures, not only as a tale of power and downfall, but as a timeless reminder that no throne, no matter how glittering, can stand forever when it rests on a crumbling foundation. But how did the Romanovs manage to bear the weight of the abdication? Were they granted any form of protection? Or did they become vulnerable to every hungry predator outside their once cherished palace? Let's find out. From imperial palaces to prison walls. Once crowned in unimaginable splendor, Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and the delicate heir Alexei, found themselves torn from the heights of imperial majesty and cast into the shadows of captivity. For years, the Romanovs had been symbols of untouchable power, surrounded by golden palaces, glittering ceremonies, and the aura of divine authority. Yet, when the empire crumbled, their crowns, palaces, and loyal armies melted away, leaving behind only a vulnerable family stripped of protection and dignity. No longer the royal figures who commanded awe across Europe, they became prisoners watched by guards who once would not have dared to look them in the eye. Their descent from the throne to confinement was not swift, but painfully drawn out, each stage of their captivity marking a further step away from their past lives. Alongside 4 of their most faithful attendants, those who refused to abandon them despite the danger, they were shuffled from one desolate place to another. The long, bitter journey led them deeper into isolation, from Tobolsk in Siberia to the grim and unwelcoming Ipatiev house in the industrial city of Yekaterinburg. The house itself was no palace, but a prison disguised as a residence. Its walls were heavy with menace, and its rooms seemed to choke with silence. The windows, once gateways to light and the outside world, were painted over, sealing the family inside a cage of gloom. Even the gardens, places that might have offered a breath of fresh air or a glimpse of freedom, were forbidden. With each restriction, their hope shrank, like a candle flickering in a cold draft. The contrast between their past and their present was impossible to ignore. These were people who had once strolled through gilded halls filled with chandeliers and mirrors, who had commanded vast lands and inspired endless loyalty. Now they moved through dim corridors where even the smallest freedoms were denied. The laughter of their children, once echoed in palace ballrooms, was now hushed by fear of reprimand from guards. Their golden past had vanished, swallowed up by the gray silence of confinement. The Tsar, once the little father of Russia, could no longer protect his own family. Alexandra, who had been both admired and resented as empress, struggled to keep her children's spirits alive in a world where joy was rationed more strictly than bread. Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, princesses who once dazzled at court, now busied themselves with sewing, reading, and small acts of comfort. Anything to distract from the oppressive reality pressing down on them. The youngest, Alexei, fragile from his lifelong illness, bore the additional weight of suffering in an environment where even the simplest medical care was a luxury. Their attendants, though not bound by blood, shared their fate willingly, tethered by loyalty and love. These men and women stood as witnesses to the Romanovs' fall, their presence a quiet reminder that even in the depths of despair, devotion could endure. Together, captives and attendants formed a fragile community, clinging to normalcy within walls that whispered of danger. But the silence of their imprisonment was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of uncertainty. Every knock on the door, every shuffle of boots in the corridor carried the weight of dread. No one told them their future, but the air itself seemed thick with the sense that something dark was drawing closer. Hope became both their anchor and their torment. They dreamed of rescue, of loyal forces rallying to free them, of exile in a friendly land where they could begin again. But as the days blurred into weeks and weeks into months, that dream dimmed. The painted-over windows not only blocked out light, but also symbolized the cruel truth. Their world was closed off, their destiny no longer theirs to shape. The Romanovs had once been more than a family. They were the embodiment of an empire.
Well, we're talking about a family that got overthrown, obviously the last Romanov family, an empire that got overthrown.
Yet in captivity, they were reduced to their simplest form. Parents trying to shield their children, sisters trying to comfort one another, attendants trying to serve despite hopeless odds. Their majesty was gone, replaced by a suffocating silence and the unshakable shadow of an unknown fate that loomed closer with every passing day. What became of the Romanovs? Which verdict was eventually passed on them? Let's dig into the details of the event that happened that tragic night when their history was written. Blood in the cellar. In the stillness of a summer night in July 1918, the Romanovs, the last imperial family of Russia, were told a story meant to soothe their fears. Guards entered their confinement and calmly announced that for their own safety, the family was to be moved. The Bolsheviks, they were told, feared approaching danger, and relocation was the only way to protect them. Reluctantly, but without resistance, the weary family prepared itself. After months of captivity, they clung to any thread of hope, no matter how thin. Safety, even if temporary, sounded like mercy. But safety was never the plan. The family was led down a narrow staircase, the echo of boots on stone, a grim march toward a fate already decided. At the bottom was a small basement room, stark and suffocating. Its only light came from a single harsh bulb dangling from the ceiling, casting long, trembling shadows against the walls. The room smelled of damp stone and oil, a claustrophobic chamber that felt more like a tomb than a place of refuge. There they stood, 11 people, all gathered under that dim light. Tsar Nicholas II, once the most powerful man in Russia, now a weary prisoner. Beside him, his wife Alexandra, her face pale but composed, clutching her youngest child as though her grip could shield him. Their 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, huddled together, their youth and elegance wrapped in fear. Next to them was the frail heir, Alexei, only 13, struggling against his hemophilia and against the cruel twists of fate. Surrounding them were loyal attendants, faithful servants who had chosen to share in the family's captivity and, unknowingly, their end. When the doors closed, a silence heavier than stone filled the air. Then came the words, delivered with the coldness of bureaucracy. A short, formal announcement declared that the Romanovs had been sentenced to death. The decree was not shouted, but read like routine business, as if ordering the execution of an entire dynasty was no more than filling out paperwork. For a brief second, the family froze. The words hung in the air like poison. Before they could fully grasp the reality, the storm began. Gunfire erupted, violent and unrelenting. The basement filled with deafening cracks as bullets tore through the air. The smell of smoke and gunpowder mixed with the cries of terror. Bullets ricocheted against the walls, striking stone and steel with sharp metallic screams. The children screamed. The women clung to one another. Nicholas tried to shield his family, but there was no shelter, no escape. Chaos ruled the room. And then came the grotesque twist of fate. The Romanov daughters had been sewn into their corsets jewels and diamonds, family treasures hidden in desperation, with the hope they might serve as future bargaining chips or tokens of survival. Instead, the gems became a tragic kind of armor. Bullets struck but did not always pierce, bouncing off the hard stones like sparks from steel. The executioners, realizing the bullets alone would not finish their grisly task, grew furious and impatient. They resorted to bayonets, stabbing again and again, turning desperation into brutality. The screams grew weaker, fading into groans and then into silence. One by one, voices were extinguished. Smoke hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as if the room itself was choking on the horror it had just witnessed. When at last the basement fell quiet, 11 bodies lay crumpled across the floor. A dynasty extinguished not on a battlefield or throne, but in a cellar reeking of smoke, sweat, and blood. What ended in that basement was more than the life of a royal family. It was the closing of a chapter that had defined centuries of Russian history. The Romanovs, who once embodied wealth, power, and divine rule, were reduced to nothing more than broken bodies and discarded names. The empire they had reigned over was gone, and the line that carried centuries of monarchy ended in gunfire and bayonets. It was not merely a dethroning, it was annihilation. The tragic night was one that rewrote history, as the dead cannot speak for themselves. Which rumors lingered after the annihilation? Let's find out. Myths, pretenders, and the uneasy silence. The Bolsheviks did not only silence lives on that fateful night in 1918, they tried to silence the truth itself. When the Romanov family met their brutal end, what followed was more than murder. It was an attempt to erase, to bury, and to confuse history itself. Bodies were thrown into shallow graves, later dug up and mutilated. Bones were burned with acid to hide all traces. Faces, once symbols of imperial majesty, were defaced so completely that recognition seemed impossible. The executioners wanted not only death, but disappearance. They believed if the remains vanished, so too would the story. But silence, as history often shows us, is never permanent. Secrets have a way of leaking through the cracks, no matter how much effort is put into sealing them. Whispers began to travel from city to city, fueled by grief, uncertainty, and the human refusal to accept total loss. Had Anastasia, the young and spirited daughter of Nicholas II, somehow escaped the massacre? Was Alexei, the frail but beloved heir, smuggled away under the cover of night? Rumors such as these spread like wildfire, igniting imaginations across Russia and far beyond. The chaos of post-revolutionary Russia made these questions difficult to put to rest. The Bolsheviks, who thrived on secrecy and propaganda, refused to give clear answers. And into that silence, stories began to bloom. People wanted desperately to believe that at least one child had survived the slaughter, that innocence had found a way to outwit cruelty. The uncertainty gave rise to an endless cycle of claims, suspicions, and imposters, each one keeping the Romanovs alive, not in flesh, but in legend. No figure embodied this strange legacy more than Anna Anderson. Emerging in the 1920s, she was fragile, mysterious, and haunted by memories that seemed too precise to dismiss. She declared herself to be Grand Duchess Anastasia. Many dismissed her as delusional, yet others, survivors of the Romanov court, aristocrats, even casual observers, were captivated. Could she truly be the lost princess? Her story took on a life of its own, feeding newspapers, gossip columns, and eventually books. To some, she was a fraud playing on tragedy. To others, she was living proof that the Bolsheviks had failed to destroy the family completely. Anna's claim sparked trials, investigations, and fierce debates. For decades, her identity hovered in uncertainty, an unsolved riddle that fascinated the world. But whether she was Anastasia or not almost became irrelevant. She had tapped into something deeper, a longing for survival, a hope that even in the darkest chapters of history, a flicker of innocence could endure. The tale of Anastasia transcended the courtroom and seeped into popular culture. Films were made, novels written, plays performed. Her supposed escape was reimagined as a grand romantic adventure, where the young Duchess evaded assassins and found love in exile. In these retellings, brutality was overshadowed by resilience. People preferred to imagine Anastasia not as a victim of Bolshevik bullets, but as a symbol of courage, of life continuing against all odds. And so, for much of the 20th century, the myth of survival loomed larger than the reality of massacre. The story of Anastasia and of Anna Anderson offered something the truth could not: hope. Hope that even in a world ravaged by war, revolutions, and loss, there remained an untouched pocket of purity. Hope that innocence had not been entirely extinguished in that basement in Ekaterinburg. The legend thrived precisely because people needed it. They needed to believe that good could slip through the cracks of evil, that a child could escape the machinery of death. The Romanovs had been symbols of power, but in their downfall, their children became symbols of something greater: the yearning for survival, the refusal to let innocence perish completely. The Bolsheviks had sought to bury not only a family, but also a dynasty, a memory, and a truth. Yet, in trying to erase them so thoroughly, they inadvertently birthed a legend that outlived their own revolution. The graves were hidden, the bones were burned, and the faces were mutilated. But the whispers endured, and those whispers became stories, and those stories became myths. In the end, the world clung not to the brutality of the night the Romanovs died, but to the dream that someone had lived. Anastasia's survival, real or imagined, became a romantic beacon, a narrative stronger than bullets, more enduring than lies. It was a reminder that history, no matter how controlled or concealed, always leaves room for mystery, and that sometimes the myth is more powerful than the truth itself. Several dynasties have ruled different parts of the world at different times. The end of the Romanovs was neither the first nor the last. What impact has the annihilated dynasty had on the world? Let's take a look at the legacy of the fallen Romanovs. Legacy of a vanished dynasty. The end of the Romanovs was not simply the tragic fall of a royal family. It was an event that reshaped Russia itself and changed the way the world thought about history, justice, and even science. When Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their children were executed in a dark cellar in 1918,
an act that was so utterly barbarous than the messy slaughter of the imperial family.
It marked the violent close of more than 300 years of Romanov rule. Yet their deaths did not just rewrite Russian politics. They also became the foundation for a new chapter in forensic science. Decades later, when the scattered remains were unearthed, science would step in, not only to uncover what happened, but to prove it with a precision never before possible. Their case became the very blueprint for how DNA evidence could be used to solve mysteries that had long seemed impossible to untangle. Before the Romanovs, cold cases, unsolved crimes, disasters, and missing persons relied heavily on speculation, testimony, and circumstantial evidence. The discovery of their remains and the subsequent testing opened the door to a revolution in forensic science. Suddenly, the idea that truth could be found in the smallest fragments of bone or strands of hair became not just believable, but undeniable. Modern forensic teams, whether investigating mass disasters or ancient graves, owe part of their confidence to the methods first sharpened in the Romanov investigation. But with that clarity came something unexpected. Science delivered answers, yes. It confirmed identities. It traced bloodlines. It closed debates that had lasted for nearly a century. Yet for many, the long-awaited closure did not bring comfort. Instead, it tore away the last threads of mystery and myth that had kept hope alive for generations. For decades, legends had circulated across the world that one or more of the children had survived, that Anastasia, in particular, had escaped the gunfire and chaos and lived out her days hidden under another name. These stories inspired films, novels, and endless fascination. They softened the brutality of the Romanovs' fate by offering a dream of survival. When DNA evidence finally settled the question, with the mystery completely solved by the advent of AI, proving beyond doubt that none of them had escaped, the legend collapsed. What was left was the raw, merciless truth. There had been no escape, no secret exile, no hidden heirs to carry on the family's legacy. There had only been a basement, the echo of gunshots, bayonets, and the brutal effort to erase an entire family from history. For those who had clung to the myths, the confirmation was like a second death, this time of hope itself. The story of the Romanovs is therefore more than history. It is a reminder of the power and the cruelty of truth. Legends can comfort, but they also deceive. Science can strip away lies, but it cannot heal the wounds those lies once softened. The Romanovs' fate highlights a deep human paradox. We long for truth, yet we often fear what it will reveal. When the truth is finally exposed, it can feel less like liberation and more like a heavy burden. What remains most haunting is not just the brutality of their end, but the question that lingers after all evidence has been examined. Does knowing the truth make us whole, or does it only deepen the sorrow? For some, knowledge is a form of justice, restoring dignity to those who were erased. For others, it is a cruel reminder that the myths we once cherished were nothing more than illusions. In the case of the Romanovs, the truth left the world with a legacy that is both groundbreaking and heartbreaking. On one hand, their story advanced forensic science in ways that continue to save lives and solve mysteries today. On the other, it stripped away every dream of survival, leaving only the unchangeable memory of a family destroyed in the darkness. Their story, once wrapped in golden myths of escape and exile, ended in violence, shadows, and silence. And perhaps that is why the Romanovs remain such an enduring symbol. They represent the fragile boundary between legend and fact, between what we wish to believe and what history insists we must face. The Romanovs' deaths gave us truth, but at the same time, they forced us to confront a final, haunting question. Is truth always a blessing, or can it also be a curse? So, do you think the Romanov mystery can ever be forgotten? Will AI be used to solve more mysteries? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe.